Hmm. Hi everyone, this is Ian Schlackman, Green Party candidate for governor, here with you this evening to bring you a green perspective on the Maryland gubernatorial debate. We did let MPT know that we demand to be in the debate. We are going to be on the ballot November 6th, myself and my lieutenant governor candidate, Reverend Annie Chambers. But they broke off communication with us essentially and decided to not include us. That's the next thing we heard. So I think this evening, for those of you who haven't known already, Democrat Ben Jealous and Governor Larry Hogan earlier had a debate. It just ended about an hour ago. It was filmed in a studio by Maryland Public Television. We want to make sure that you get the full perspective of all the candidates that are running. I'll be on the ballot November 6th, and we want to make sure that you know what we would do if myself, representing the Green Party, would do if elected to governor. We feel it's really important to give you the full set of perspectives around this matter. And I thoroughly hope that the two Maryland gubernatorial candidates decide to have more debates. Funny enough, MPT wound up admitting that this joint one debate thing was actually done by the two different parties, by the Democrats and Republicans. That's the deal that they came up with. So we are urging them to expand the debates, have more debates, add us to it, and have a lieutenant governor debate as well, because our own Reverend Annie Chambers, former Black Panther, current RAB delegate to the HUD Housing Authority, needs to be heard as well. Everyone needs to be heard in this debate. It's too important. So with that, I am going to go through each of the questions that all of the different candidates were asked. And then on top of that, we will, if you want to post a question, hopefully we'll be able to see it. And if we have a moment, we'll be able to answer it. And then at the end of it, we'll make a closing statement. And that'll pretty much be it. And please share the video, share this around, make sure people understand that there are more than two candidates in this debate, in this governor's race. It's very important that we get the message out there that this is more than two parties. The Green Party is ballot qualified and will be on the ballot. So it's really important people understand. We get this question all the time. We didn't hear about you till we saw you on the ballot. Well, we try to get into the debates. Some candidates even go there and get thrown off the stage. So we try our best. We really do. So tonight we're going to present you our version of what would happen if we were in the debate. Thank you. Okay, so what policies would we enact to stimulate the private sector and raise wages? So this one's very, very easy for us, because I have been saying from day one of this campaign that we want to do a universal basic income. We feel a universal basic income is the cornerstone of economic stability. This is a policy that Martin Luther King called for way back in the 60s. It's not some new radical policy that we're making up. It's something that we know would abolish poverty. It's something that organizations like the Poor People's Campaign and Welfare Rights Organization have been calling for decades. It's been tried in Canada and in the US and across the world, and it's shown that when someone knows that you're getting an annual income, a monthly income of $1,000 a month, you know that you're going to have enough money to pay your bills, to pay your rent, to make sure your kids have enough food on the table. It's going to provide a whole host of economic security that just isn't there right now. So we've got to look at a basic income. It's incredibly important. The next thing I want to also talk about is a job guarantee. Now, our campaign is calling for a job guarantee. I know this is getting a lot of attention, this particular policy, but we want to make sure it's done with a basic income, because we can't be asking, take a walk through any public housing project in Maryland. What are you going to find? So many individuals that are disabled from one way or another. So it's imperative that we make sure that you don't have to grab a broom and have a, I hate to use this term, but a BS job. I think it's actually a new book out that I recommend, that's sitting on my kitchen table, David Graeber, I think, who actually calls for BS jobs. We're just creating jobs for the sake of creating jobs. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I think it's time that we show that we don't need to just make up random jobs and give people employment. And that's just not the way to go. We have enough money to make sure that everyone gets enough, to make sure that every Marylander will be taken care of economically no matter what. It's really important. And then finally, we are calling for universal health care as well. I think in the debates tonight you actually saw this point mentioned, and I'm going to make sure it's mentioned again. And that is that small businesses' number one concern, and I'm a small business owner, so I take this to heart, our number one concern is healthcare cost. Healthcare costs are drowning small businesses in this country. It would be the most pro-small business, pro-entrepreneurial decision that you could make to have a universal healthcare system in this country. Now, we differ from the Democrats in this because we're not calling for a one-state solution to universal health care. Maryland is unfortunately too small a state to just be the only state in a universal health care system. It would be very expensive. Not as expensive as our current system, I will admit that, but very expensive. So we're calling for a regional health care system. That is one that is across different regions. We want to make sure we could do this with New York, so we're very for New York passing their own health care bill, Pennsylvania and Maryland as well. And we expand it across the country as we go. And we want to make sure that this is known that as governor, we would prioritize federal legislation as well to call for universal basic health care. So those are our top three issues. We think those would invigorate the economy like nothing else. Next question is, what can you do to prevent deaths by legally owned guns? This is a fantastic question. I think that you've seen both. Well, let's be clear. So the Republicans on this really don't have a strategy. It's thoughts and prayers every single time the gun issue comes up. Every single time you see a workplace shooting. Last week there were 3 workplace shootings in one day, and the biggest one was right here in Maryland, up in Aberdeen. It was absolutely... the level of tragedy cannot be overstated. I think that the Republicans clearly don't have a plan on this at all. But the Democrats also are really wishy-washy on their plan. So on the one hand, you're seeing calls to investigate bump stocks, and then sometimes we're seeing things like, well, we'll explore investigating bump stocks, we'll do a soft ban on bump stocks. People need to know that bump stocks, an actual device that manufacturers make that turn a semi-automatic weapon into a fully automatic weapon, which is illegal, are being manufactured all the time. We've known this for decades. Anyone that's studied the gun industry knows that these devices are being made. They're being made for existing guns that are out there. So we call for a full ban on bump stocks nationally. And we also call for an expanded look at the economics behind workplace shootings. We feel strongly that violence in this state is wildly out of control. You see violence in the inner cities in Baltimore. You see violence in our workplaces like we experienced last week. And I think that the only real solution here, and we have it, is a universal basic income. You see, it's beyond time that we recognize that when you don't do what needs to be done to make sure that someone can be economically taken care of as a whole person, that we don't really understand what's going to happen to them next. We don't really know day to day what that person's going to be thinking. And so it's time to make sure a universal basic income is there for everyone in the state. And it's also time to recognize the fact that we have laws on the books that ban automatic weapons, yet we don't really enforce them. And the final thing I want to say on this topic, which I think is the most important, is that the gun laws that do exist are wildly racially insensitive. Let's be frank. If you've studied the far-right movement in this country at all, you know that there are constitutionalists, there are right-wing factions that are stockpiling guns. There was an estimated 8 million AR-15 weapons in this country somewhere, yet no one can tell us where they are exactly or who owns them. Well, we sort of know where they are. They're in compounds in right-wing, crazy right-wing plantations in backwoods areas. There's really no other way for me to say it. This is what it is. Yet when you go into Baltimore City, police officers literally putting handguns on individuals and then charging them with 3, 4, 5, 10 years of prison time. So what we're seeing is a absolutely racially insensitive gun policy, where if you're white and you're right wing, you're allowed to have all the guns you want in a bunker that no one knows about. Yet if you're black and in the middle of the city, slightest being near a gun, being seen around a gun is going to get you a gun charge and maybe years in prison. So we've absolutely got to address this in multiple different levels. All right. Our next question is, how far are you willing to go to fill shortages in corrections officers? This is a fantastic question. I'm really glad this question came up. You know, when I went down to the Eastern Shore, I did an interview with, a TV interview with Ryan Eldridge, who was one of the presenters tonight, one of the reporters that presented tonight the question. And I think it's a fantastic question because it speaks to the fact that the state does not really take seriously its obligation to find employment for institutions where it's responsible for people. And this looks the same in the foster care system as it does for correction officers. We've had correction officers in ECI in Maryland and the Eastern Shore, through their union, making it clear that the prisons are unsafe, that there needs to be more prison guards with better working hours, better working conditions. And just think about it, if the labor union's saying that for the corrections officers, just think how bad that prison is for the actual prisoners in it. My running mate, Reverend Annie Chambers, has done an enormous amount of prison rights work. And it's so sad to see the conditions in these prisons across the state. I don't care if you're going to the Eastern Shore or Jessup or Western Maryland or Hagerstown. The conditions of our prisons are absolutely abysmal. And jails, don't even get me started on that. One of the jails here in Baltimore City hasn't had running water for months. And the prisoners were just expected to deal with it. We would never allow that in a workplace. But for some reason, when it comes to prisons, we just throw people away. So it's really beyond time that we take our responsibility to our state-run institutions far more seriously. It's time that we recruit more, but it's also time that we acknowledge that our prisons are wildly overcrowded. We're now in the process, I like to say it, of actually repealing and undoing some of our racist anti-marijuana laws. And some of the things we're seeing is medicinal use of marijuana, and now the discussion of recreational use of marijuana. Well, before you can have a serious conversation about recreational use or medicinal use of marijuana, why aren't we saying that we've admitted as a culture that we're done with locking people up for marijuana? So doesn't that mean that it's now time to make sure that everyone that's in prison on a marijuana charge gets released? That's the first thing we should have done in the beginning. That's how we should have started this debate on cannabis reform. You can't keep those poor people in jail. My campaign actually did back in 2016, we did a talk in Baltimore City. And a young woman came up to us afterwards and said, look, I used to be a dealer, I'll be honest with you, and I want to go straight. I want to sell it legally now, but I don't know how to do it. I don't understand. I see these places popping up. How do I do it? And I said to her, well, write a big campaign check to Larry Hogan and hire yourself a ton of lawyers, because that's how these big new shiny cannabis centers are opening up in the state. And it's completely unfair. Why aren't we allowing individuals that are entrepreneurs that want to legally sell marijuana, who are currently in prison, the first bite at the apple to sell it? If you did that, our prisons would be emptier than ever before. But we've got to look at this from a racial lens, and we simply don't. And it's time that we do that. Okay, our next question is, where can the state get the money to address the opioid epidemic? This is another fantastic question. See, also back in 2016, we actually had a conversation specifically on legalizing drugs as a method to creating safe injection sites that were supervised that would help stop overdose deaths. And I'm proud to say that Kevin Zeese was actually with us there, and Margaret Flowers as well. And Kevin Zeese, for those that don't know, was named LEAP's Law Enforcement Officers against Prohibition, against marijuana prohibition, Marylander of the Year, because he understands the key points on this issue. Legalizing drugs would be the first step in making sure we could treat this as the medical issue that it is. You see, if we don't have a universal single-payer system that allows for full treatment of drug addiction programs coupled with legalization, then you don't really have a state system that can handle the opioid crisis. Drive up to Westminster like I did the other day, and you see big signs that say, if you see an overdose death, don't run away, call 911. And it's because people understand that if they are near someone doing drugs or or having an opioid overdose, they don't want to be involved with a crime. They're just walking away from that person and leaving them there to die. And that's the stem of this issue. We can't get people the proper help that they need if everything they're doing is illegal, because then a police officer is going to be required to lock them up and throw away the key. And that's the way we're going to treat opioid addiction in this country as we've continued to go on. We've got to change the game. We've got to change the laws in the state. We have to make sure that if you need treatment, the second you're able to get treatment is the second you can walk into a treatment center completely paid for and turn your life around. It's imperative that we change our mindset around this issue. We're never going to actually make progress on this issue unless we do. And I'm 100% for, no, I'm going to mispronounce this word, I apologize, naloxone injections and carrying them on medical staff throughout the state, on EMTs, and getting people trained on how to use them, getting people trained to have them around more. But that's only step one. It's really only step one. And I think it actually shows some of the budgeting issues we've had around this actually show that without a single payer system that says we're going to cover this regardless, we're going to cover this as a health issue regardless of what condition that you're in. Unless we start there, we're always going to be fighting with each other saying, no, we need that drug here, no, we need that drug here, we need more treatment here, we need more treatment here. It's got to be universal and across the state. It's got to be done through a legal method that makes sense. And it's got to be done universally through universal single-payer health care. All right, next question coming up. I do want to thank everyone that's watching. Please describe your vision for mass transit. Wow, this is a great question. I think on this issue, you've seen... Well, first of all, I think that what Larry Hogan did, Governor Hogan did, in canceling the light rail, the red line in Baltimore City, was atrocious. And I'm going to take it a lot further than I think the Democratic candidate did and say that it was a civil rights violation. That red line would have helped communities trying to have working class everyday jobs going across the city east to west. We don't have a transportation in Baltimore system that's east to west right now, and we desperately needed it, and it was taken off the table, essentially by Larry Hogan in one fell swoop. Now, what he gave us instead was a absolutely broken bus transit system that simply looks terrible. I mean, I've never seen a system spend so much money on marketing and so little money on infrastructure. You actually spend some time in Baltimore City, you'll see it. Every bus is now redone, big bold letters, Baltimore Link. Every single bus stop looks exactly the same. They didn't actually put any money into it. They never actually redid any of the bus stops. And if you know anything about Baltimore City, our bus stops are atrocious. They are basically a bench, sometimes no bench at all, just a post. You stand there, heat in the summer, snow in the winter, no place to sit, no heating, no enclosure. And the few enclosures we have, because of Baltimore Link, didn't get any update at all. I mean, I can't even imagine how you do a bus system update without actually helping people that take the bus every day. And the bus system is 100% worse. I will say that. Democratic challenger Ben Jealous mentioned this, and I will echo it. For those of you that ride the bus, like I have, like Reverend Chambers does every single day, my running mate, you know that the Baltimore Link system has made it so much harder. There are far fewer bus lines than there are now. So we have to completely undo what Governor Hogan has done. And we've got to look more at the light rail system that we have and reinvesting in it. And then we have to look back again at expanding our subway system, especially the Red Line. We've got to get that money back. We've got to work towards it. You know, investment in public infrastructure like rail lines isn't just good for construction jobs, it's also good permanently throughout the year because it helps create stable transportation that people know they can rely on. If you know one thing about the bus service in Baltimore City, before or after Governor Hogan's Baltimore Link system, you know that buses in Baltimore City are constantly late. Constantly late. And I do want to mention other parts of the state as well. I'm a big proponent of making sure there's a proper funding for MARC. I take MARC all the time. A big proponent for making sure there's proper funding of the Washington Metro system. And I think that we've gone very far in funding that, but we have to go a lot further. Because if you see very carefully, the DC Metro system is... if not properly invested in, it will be in a shambles. It's pretty clear if you look at that system and what's happening there. There's been lots of talks on it in D.C. It's time that we give it a Maryland solution and make sure that the funding, at least on the Maryland side, is taken care of. Okay, our next question is, what 3 actions would you take to close the educational achievement gap? This is a wonderful question. Last winter, the schools froze in Baltimore City. Let's just be frank with you. What happened? The heating system failed to work. Pipes burst everywhere. There were giant puddles of ice all over the place. Kids were sliding throughout the street and getting home from school as they closed it. And for those of you that may not be in the Baltimore area, you may not know this, but when you door knock in Baltimore, when you talk to people, you actually find a lot of kids that are home from school, especially in the winter and the summer, or the late school year. You ask them, what are you doing home? Is your mom home? What are you doing? And they say, school's closed. And you go, why? And they say, no air conditioning, too hot. Or they say, heating system closed, it's too cold. I have to close the whole school again. This has not been a new phenomenon. This has been happening in Baltimore City for years. There has never been a proper fix to the heating system. Baltimore City still has schools that have asbestos. They still have schools that have lead. And the drinking water isn't even potable. You can't drink the drinking water in a Baltimore City school. There's mold everywhere. Teachers and students have been complaining about this for years. Nothing gets done. And I think tonight you saw a really good example of the Democrats and Republicans looking at each other in the face and just pointing the finger and blaming each other. Blame, 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 blame. It's the other party. It's the other side. That's why nothing gets done, etc., etc. The governor has so much ability to move things around here, it's crazy. And we should not be letting Governor Larry Hogan get away with these horrible talking points. First of all, Baltimore City does not have an elected school board. Now, the mayor has been given a lot more power recently over who's on the school board. But before that, the governor also had a say on who's the school board. So right then and there, you've got a dual problem. Democrat Mayor Pugh, Republican Governor Larry Hogan have both let down Baltimore City students. Full stop. At this point in time, the first thing we have to do is have an elected school board in Baltimore City. And now on top of that, we've got to make sure we're giving out funding equally to rural areas and to wealthy suburban areas. That's why I'm 100% in favor of the Kirwan Commission. I have no idea why neither candidate mentioned the Kirwan Commission tonight. I don't know if they've forgotten about it or what. But it's incredibly important that we actually follow the Kirwan Commission's recommendations. But why? The Kirwan Commission has already met. They've already spoke. They've already talked about where to increase funding, where the gaps are. Why haven't we actually gone through with any of their recommendations? Because they said, you know what? It's an election year, and we're going to hold our recommendations till after the election. Why aren't people outraged about this? They blatantly said, because it's an election year, we would rather run campaigns and blame each other across the aisle, Democrats to Republicans, Republicans to Democrats, and never get anything done for our kids. It's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous. The Democrats and Republicans should be ashamed for themselves. I am tired of hearing them complain and bash each other and get nothing done for the kids in this state. I work in schools. I work in low-income schools. These kids deserve better than this. They don't deserve to be part of this partisan bickering. Okay, our next question is, how are we preparing to lift the Eastern Shore and Western Maryland out of poverty? This is such a fantastic question. So I have been out to Western Maryland a few times now. I've been out to the Eastern Shore. I do want to take this question separately because I do think it's two separate issues. On the Eastern Shore, you have generations of poverty that have never properly been lifted out. And I'm just going to come right out and say it. A lot of it are black families that have simply been left behind. Now, my running mate, Reverend Annie Chambers, was actually a Black Panther. And one of the things that she did was go down to the Eastern Shore and take families that were sharecroppers, that were getting zero services from the county and from the state. No schools, no facilities. I mean, you're talking rural squalor that you wouldn't believe back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And she would bring those families to a better place where they could get decent services. Now, I think a lot of those families simply have never been uplifted out of poverty, the ones that are left behind. So that's why it's so important that my campaign is calling for a basic income guarantee. Because Martin Luther King himself said that this basic income guarantee would abolish poverty, and we feel it would abolish poverty in one generation. These families that have been left behind, you get a check in the mail every month, $1,000 per person, a small stipend for your child, and you could spend it on what you need. Because if you've ever been into the home of a poor family, you know that they are stretching a dollar far longer than any wealthy family out there. Now, I want to say on the Western Maryland, I went out there to Hagerstown, and a good friend of mine out there showed me this amazing former military base that right next door to it was this acres of public housing, just enormous amounts of public housing, but it was vacant and graffitied. And I asked him what happened here, and he said they sold it. I said, who sold it? He said the city decided in a late night meeting without telling anyone to sell this whole public housing project to a foreign, an international, some Asian banking interest that promised to turn it into, I'm not sure what. But the bottom line is it's not public housing anymore. And I said, well, where did the people go that lived here? He said they kicked them out with less than 30 days. It was the saddest thing he's ever seen. In this state, rural, urban, suburban, public housing is under attack. There is nothing that Democrats and Republicans agree on more, and that they no longer want public housing. They want the marketplace, they want capitalism to provide all the housing, and they don't care if housing and rents go up to $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 for a one-bedroom New York City style. It's absolutely time that we say that this is completely wrong, and we've got to redo our thinking when it comes to public housing. Any property the state owns, and in Baltimore City, there's plenty here. Out in Western Maryland, there's plenty of properties. Out in Eastern Shore, there's plenty of properties. We need to turn that into public housing, state and federal dollars. So it's time that we rethink the way that we're doing public housing in the state. We got to invest more in it. We have to make it clean, safe, and affordable. And that's what I would do Eastern Shore to Western Maryland. Okay, next question. What will your commitment be to Marylanders who live outside of the Baltimore-Washington area? It's an interesting question right after the last one, actually, because I feel like I kind of touched on it already. It's not universal. I think that's really important. Anyone that's toured this state would understand that the same solutions that work for rural Eastern Shore are not the same solutions that would work for rural, suburban, Western Maryland. So right there, we have to look at things a little differently, or Calvert County, or Southern Maryland. I think that the first thing I want to talk about is the environment, Because right now, the Hogan administration is using the Maryland Department of the Environment incredibly unevenly. In Calvert County, they're trying to build they built an export facility for natural frack gas. Now, Governor Hogan now agrees that we shouldn't have frack gas in the state when we're a non-fracking state. Yet for some reason we're building pipelines all across the state to ship natural gas. These pipelines are as explosive as fracking itself. They're filled with natural gas. They're going to explode in a minute. And now we have an export terminal down there in Calvert County. So the citizens of Calvert County don't want this. They protested it. They went to local meetings. The city, children, young people, old people, they're affected by this. And yet the state just rails it through. It's completely ridiculous. There needs to be equal representation throughout the state. Equal representation throughout the state. Forest and burning it in a process called biomass is now part of our clean energy portfolio. And you can thank the Democratic Party for this one because they let this happen in their bill. The Democratic Party, by the way, has a supermajority in the House of Delegates and the Senate. And they think that burning the forest somehow equals clean, environmentally positive energy. It doesn't. And the people in Western Maryland are pretty tired of watching deforestation come through in the name of jobs. You know, it's absolutely... In Baltimore County, getting a solar farm passed takes months of hard work getting it through the local government, making sure citizens are okay with it. Meanwhile, in Western Maryland, just simply cutting down a forest and giving jobs to people there for that are all temporary, you know, can be done tomorrow, thanks to the Hogan administration and their terrible Maryland Department of the Environment not providing a clean and equitable slate across the board for environmental projects that produce energy. And so until we actually take this seriously, until we actually figure out how we're going to evenly across the board, Western Maryland, Southern Maryland, Eastern Shore, deal with our completely disparate and nonsensical environmental issues and what we're going to fund through tax credits, we're never going to have equal policies throughout the state. Okay, so our next question is... Our last question is, if you had 1 minute with President Trump, what would you tell him? You know, I just want to take a quick second. I'm gonna break the format for a second to just say, when I heard the answers on this, I was shocked, because to me, there's only one answer if you're going to talk to President Trump for 1 minute, and that one-word answer is resign. That's what I want. A population that Donald Trump and his ilk have brought together to be the base now of the Republican Party. So for the sake of the country, I do think the man should resign. Our president should resign. I have no qualm saying that. And I further want to say that I think until you have a functional democracy in this country, where we don't just have two parties that go back and forth, and no real progress is made, and our kids keep freezing in schools, and no one's really taking care of economic issues, until you actually have a party, until you have more parties that are actually talking about different ways to tackle problems, like our party, the Green Party, you're going to keep seeing this back and forth between the Republican and Democratic Party that's going to go nowhere. And it's going to give rise to demagogues like our president, Donald Trump. Now, you know, it's really interesting to see a Republican like Trump talk about trade and be anti-NAFTA and be anti-global trade, because I think that there have been progressives and socialists and Greens that have been saying that international free trade has been hurting the country forever. But because like right now, I'm not in the debate. I have to do this from a live stream. I can't tell you this using Maryland Public Television's dollars like the Democrats and Republicans can. So we never get heard. And then who rises to power? Donald Trump riding on the Republican ticket. So we're not really prepared at this point in time in our country to have a serious look at ourselves and our political system. We're not really ready right now to have that debate about, you know, growing our democracy and making sure everyone on election day feels like they have someone to vote for. And we're not just holding our nose and voting for a candidate that we don't really like because we feel that the other candidate's so bad. And, you know, I don't think I've ever seen an election, not to go all the way back to 2016, but I don't think I've ever seen an election where two candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, only inspire people to come out to the polls because the other side hated them so much. That's not a functional democracy. We need to be the adults in the room and say, this is a big problem. If people are only coming to the polls because they hate the other side and they don't really understand all the issues at play and who Donald Trump represents and who Hillary Clinton represents, we need to change the game. We need to quickly develop third parties into massive structures that are actually taking a oppositional populist agenda to the status quo. Other countries have done this across the world. You've seen this in Spain. You see this in Greece. Whenever there's a national front, a right-wing fascist gaining power, an opposition party forms. It's not of the two main parties. And I think it's beyond time to take ourselves seriously in the United States and call for an oppositional party that's not of the Democrats or Republicans. It's taking the populist issues and turning them into something that's more akin to something on the left, something akin to socialism, or something akin to, and I'm a socialist, unapologetic socialist, something akin to post-scarcity economics, something where we're not thinking in the same two-dimensional box about capitalism and job growth and that kind of thing. So with that, I'm over time on this issue, so I'll just look to the moderator here. That's it. Is all. That's it. That's the end of the questions. I so appreciate everyone who's watched this tonight. I'm really glad that we did this and that you all were able to tune in. I appreciate everyone online there for your comments. They've been very supportive and helpful. I will make a brief closing statement by just saying that what we saw tonight with the Hogan and Jealous debate did us no favors. You've seen Democrats either run over to the Hogan camp, thinking Jealous is so far behind he's never going to win, or dig their heels in for Jealous and frankly start saying some things that his campaign isn't even talking about anymore. You've seen Governor Hogan come in sort of as this outsider who's going to play both sides. He's a Democrat, he's a Republican, he's everything you want him to be, depending on how you look at him. Yet he takes a pretty traditional Republican pro-capitalist stance. They talked a lot about small businesses, but I've never seen either of these candidates actually work with a small business like I have, helping them grow and helping them across the state. And so, when I see the same old politics of let's try to get big business here, Ben Jealous is a venture capitalist. His trade is in big business. Larry Hogan is a real estate millionaire. I don't know why he's calling himself a small business person. He's not. He's a real estate millionaire. Neither of these candidates would say, let's stop working on getting Amazon here. Let's stop and admit that Discovery just left Montgomery County. Discovery Corporation had no allegiance to Maryland. We could spend all day trying to create tax breaks and tax credits for the largest businesses on the planet, owned by the richest people on the planet, to come to Maryland. And it's a race to the bottom. We didn't even hear about $15 an hour minimum wage increase tonight in the debate. Where was that? Are the Democrats serious about getting this for us? Are they going to be able to convince Republicans? Do they need to convince Republicans to get $15 an hour minimum wage? When are we going to get it done? I'm tired of seeing Democrats in Baltimore City take Donald Trump's lead and Ben Carson's lead and close more public housing projects. Why isn't this an issue that's on the table? I think that you need to look outside the box in terms of your politics. You need to start to think about, is capitalism really going to save the world? Can we just tweak and change some things here and there? Can we attract enough business to Maryland, keep it out of Virginia, keep it out of DC, get it here in Maryland and raise our jobs? Is that really going to work? Or is it time for policies that we've been talking about for decades but never implemented, like a basic income guarantee, like universal health care, like a jobs guarantee? It's time to take ourselves seriously and realize that we are the ones that need to implement these policies. We need to call for them. We need to support politicians that are calling for them. We need to get these issues on. We're the only campaign calling for a millionaire's tax. We're the only campaign that says both Governor Hogan and venture capitalist Ben Jealous would both be taxed quite a bit in our plan. And that's where you get the extra money from to do the things that we're talking about. That's how we pay for universal basic income. That's how we pay for universal health care. That's how we pay for a jobs program. So it's time that we acknowledge that if we do not take action now, if we do not move on environmental catastrophes happening to us, if we don't move on climate change, if we don't move on economic reforms in the state, serious ones that really tackle economic inequality at its base, we're going to continue to see an increase in violence in Maryland, an increase in our emergencies, or when it comes to the climate change emergency in our state, less and less public housing. Our rents are going to continue to go up, and no one is ever going to have the courage to stand up and pro-capitalist traditional policies. It doesn't matter if Amazon stays in this community, because we care about the small businesses in this community. We care about the young entrepreneur just graduating college, making sure they don't have to be straddled by thousands of dollars worth of student loan debts. That's right in our platform. We want to make sure there's a public bank in Maryland so we can keep our money local and not just hand it off to Bank of America or Wells Fargo. There are so many things like this. We're the only campaign calling for a release of prisoners that are behind bars because of cannabis laws that were prohibition cannabis laws. We're the only campaign that's calling for that. And right now you're seeing more business as usual, more giant amounts of money given to lawyers by, being well stocked with lawyers and large amounts of credit. We need to level the playing field for small businesses and the everyday person. We need to focus on working class and poor people around the country, around the state. And that's what Reverend Chambers and I are doing in this. We are not interested in the average super voter who's out there, who is middle class, who is doing okay. We are out there working to make sure that poor, low-income people, working class people, people that just graduate from college, that are straddled with debt, know that we have a real solution, and it doesn't look like the other guys, to the everyday problems that they face. And we could end poverty in this state in one generation if we would just take ourselves seriously and finally vote outside the box, finally stop voting for the two major parties and look elsewhere. It's time to take ourselves seriously. It's time to stop blaming fingers at each other. Our state is not getting better with either Democrats or Republicans in charge. That's clear. And it's time that we voted Green Party. And with that, I will leave you all tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Tomorrow morning at noon, we will be on WYPR if you are in the YPR radius here in Maryland. And other than that, we will see you later. All right, take care, everyone.